The rhythmic clang of the great temporal forge was usually a comfort, a steady heartbeat for Ethelberg, but today it grated against Ilara's nerves. Each strike of the hammers, each hiss of steam from the massive brass conduits, amplified the insidious hum that burrowed deep behind her eyes. It was a dissonant, almost physical vibration, a wrongness in the very fabric of reality that only she seemed to perceive. She pressed her temples, trying to force it away, to focus on the delicate art of shaping raw temporal flux into perfect crystalline time ingots. Sweat slicked her brow, not just from the forge's infernal heat, but from the immense concentration required to silence the internal clamor. Around her, other chronosmiths moved with practiced efficiency, their faces serene, untroubled by the temporal undertow that threatened to drag Ilara into its depths. They saw only the smooth, unblemished surface of the time ingots, ready to be distributed across the city to extend a merchant's workday or allow a couple to relive a cherished memory. Ilara saw a fragile construct, perpetually on the verge of fracturing. The air shimmered with latent time, the scent of ozone and polished brass thick in her lungs. She picked up a freshly forged ingot, its facets gleaming like trapped starlight. It was flawless by all outward appearances. Yet as her fingers brushed its cool surface, the hum intensified, sharp and insistent, whispering of forgotten echoes. It was different from the usual generalized dissonance. This ingot felt profoundly, uniquely wrong. She felt a tremor in her hand, a subconscious recoil from its cold, silent scream. A beautiful piece, Ilara. The voice, deep and resonant, belonged to Master Theron. He emerged from the swirling steam, his robes pristine amidst the soot and grit, his expression a familiar blend of paternal pride and unwavering authority. Precision, grace, an ingot worthy of the archives. You continue to be our finest artisan. Ilara managed a faint smile, the effort costing her. Theron's presence always seemed to amplify the pressure, his calm demeanor an unspoken testament to the Guild's unwavering belief in their carefully curated timeline. "Thank you, Master Theron," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady to mask the tremor that still vibrated through her fingertips. The hum pulsed, a warning against the deception. Theron laid a hand briefly on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Remember, child, our work is not merely to craft time, but to perfect it. To smooth out the rough edges of history, to remove the shadows that could once again engulf us. A clean timeline is a peaceful timeline." His gaze swept over the pristine ingots cooling on the racks, then settled back on her, warm yet piercing. "Never allow discord to mar your concentration. Purity of thought creates purity of form." His words, meant to reassure, only fueled the hum. Purity. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She knew deep within her bones that the discord he spoke of was not an external distraction, but an integral part of what she felt. It was the sound of something being violently suppressed, of history crying out from beneath layers of polished deceit. This particular ingot, vibrating in her palm, was a focal point for that unheard wail. It felt cold, unnaturally heavy, as if burdened by a ghost. Ilara nodded, feigning understanding. She watched Theron walk away, his figure receding into the industrial grandeur of the forge, his philosophy a suffocating blanket over the raw truth she sensed. The dissonant hum pulsed faster, a frantic rhythm against the quiet beat of her own heart. She glanced down at the problematic ingot, then at the rows of identical, perfect ingots awaiting transport. They were destined for the city archives, to serve as anchors for the collective memory, or rather the collective unmemory that the Guild painstakingly maintained. She gathered a stack of finished ingots, including the one that felt so fundamentally wrong, careful to keep it nestled in the middle of the pile. Her arms ached, not just from the weight of the metal, but from the invisible burden of the temporal incongruity. Each step toward the archive cart felt like walking against a current, the hum, a rising tide threatening to drown her. Her vision blurred at the edges, the geometric precision of the forge wavering. This was more than just a bad day. The very air seemed stretched thin, brittle. Her foot caught on an errant gear, a sudden jarring jolt. The stack of ingots shifted precariously in her arms. Her grip, already compromised by the temporal strain, failed. The crystalline blocks tumbled. Most clattered harmlessly to the grimy floor, their perfect forms intact. But the one that pulsed with the deepest wrongness, the one whose silent scream Ilara had felt, struck the hard stone at an odd angle. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across its luminous surface, then deepened, blooming into a jagged crack. For a breathless moment, a faint ethereal glow emanated from within the flawed crystal, and the hum, for the briefest, most terrifying instant, became a roar. The rhythmic clang of the great temporal forge was usually a comfort, a steady heartbeat for Ethelberg, but today it grated against Ilara's nerves. Each strike of the hammers, each hiss of steam from the massive brass conduits, amplified the insidious hum that burrowed deep behind her eyes. It was a dissonant, almost physical vibration, a wrongness in the very fabric of reality that only she seemed to perceive. She pressed her temples, trying to force it away, to focus on the delicate art of shaping raw temporal flux into perfect crystalline time ingots. Sweat slicked her brow, not just from the forge's infernal heat, but from the immense concentration required to silence the internal clamor. Around her, other chronosmiths moved with practiced efficiency, their faces serene, untroubled by the temporal undertow that threatened to drag Ilara into its depths. They saw only the smooth, unblemished surface of the time ingots, ready to be distributed across the city to extend a merchant's workday or allow a couple to relive a cherished memory. Ilara saw a fragile construct, perpetually on the verge of fracturing. The air shimmered with latent time, the scent of ozone and polished brass, thick in her lungs. She picked up a freshly forged ingot, its facets gleaming like trapped starlight. It was flawless by all outward appearances. Yet, as her fingers brushed its cool surface, the hum intensified, sharp and insistent, whispering of forgotten echoes. It was different from the usual generalized dissonance. This ingot felt profoundly, uniquely wrong. She felt a tremor in her hand, a subconscious recoil from its cold, silent scream. A beautiful piece, Ilara. The voice, deep and resonant, belonged to Master Theron. He emerged from the swirling steam, his robes pristine amidst the soot and grit, his expression a familiar blend of paternal pride and unwavering authority. Precision, grace, an ingot worthy of the archives. You continue to be our finest artisan. Ilara managed a faint smile, the effort costing her. Theron's presence always seemed to amplify the pressure, his calm demeanor an unspoken testament to the Guild's unwavering belief in their carefully curated timeline. "Thank you, Master Theron," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady, to mask the tremor that still vibrated through her fingertips. The hum pulsed, a warning against the deception. Theron laid a hand briefly on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Remember, child, our work is not merely to craft time, but to perfect it, to smooth out the rough edges of history, to remove the shadows that could once again engulf us. A clean timeline is a peaceful timeline." His gaze swept over the pristine ingots cooling on the racks, then settled back on her, warm yet piercing. "Never allow discord to mar your concentration. Purity of thought creates purity of form." His words, meant to reassure, only fueled the hum. Purity. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She knew, deep within her bones, that the discord he spoke of was not an external distraction, but an integral part of what she felt. It was the sound of something being violently suppressed, of history crying out from beneath layers of polished deceit. This particular ingot, vibrating in her palm, was a focal point for that unheard wail. It felt cold, unnaturally heavy, as if burdened by a ghost. Ilara nodded, feigning understanding. She watched Theron walk away, his figure receding into the industrial grandeur of the forge, his philosophy a suffocating blanket over the raw truth she sensed. The dissonant hum pulsed faster, a frantic rhythm against the quiet beat of her own heart. She glanced down at the problematic ingot, then at the rows of identical, perfect ingots awaiting transport. They were destined for the city archives to serve as anchors for the collective memory, or rather, the collective unmemory that the Guild painstakingly maintained. She gathered a stack of finished ingots, including the one that felt so fundamentally wrong, careful to keep it nestled in the middle of the pile. Her arms ached, not just from the weight of the metal, but from the invisible burden of the temporal incongruity. Each step toward the archive cart felt like walking against a current, the hum, a rising tide threatening to drown her. Her vision blurred at the edges, the geometric precision of the forge wavering. This was more than just a bad day. The very air seemed stretched thin, brittle. Her foot caught on an errant gear, a sudden jarring jolt. The stack of ingots shifted precariously in her arms. Her grip, already compromised by the temporal strain, failed. The crystalline blocks tumbled. Most clattered harmlessly to the grimy floor, their perfect forms intact. But the one that pulsed with the deepest wrongness, the one whose silent scream Ilara had felt, struck the hard stone at an odd angle. A hairline fracture spider-webbed across its luminous surface, then deepened, blooming into a jagged crack. For a breathless moment, a faint ethereal glow emanated from within the flawed crystal, and the hum, for the briefest, most terrifying instant, became a roar. The roar was not merely a sound, but a physical force that struck Ilara to her core, dropping her to the cold flagstones of the forge. The world of brass and steam dissolved, replaced by a torrent of sensations that were not her own. She was standing in a sun-drenched plaza, the air thick with the scent of roasted nuts and sweet pastries. Colorful banners snapped in a warm breeze, and the sound of laughter and lively music washed over her in waves. A child, a little girl with her own dark hair, was perched on the shoulders of a man with kind eyes and a laugh that crinkled their corners. The man pointed to a puppet show, his voice a warm rumble of joy that vibrated through her. The feeling was not of watching a memory, but of living it, a profound, unequivocal happiness that felt more real and solid than any moment of her own life. His name, Lorik, echoed in the space where her own thoughts should have been. Just as suddenly as it began, the vision shattered. The vibrant festival collapsed back into the grimy, echoing vastness of the forge. The roar subsided, collapsing back into the familiar, insidious hum that now seemed to thrum with a mocking intelligence. Ilara gasped, the cold stone a shock against her cheek. She pushed herself up, her limbs trembling, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the workshop, but the shift change had emptied it. The great furnaces were being damped, and the last of her fellow smiths were shuffling toward the exits, oblivious. Master Theron was gone. Her eyes darted to the floor, finding the scattered pile of perfect, gleaming time ingots, and among them the source. The flawed ingot lay apart, its ethereal glow faded, but the jagged crack in its surface now a gaping wound. It pulsed with a faint internal light, and the hum resonated directly from it, a silent song of wrongness. With a shaking hand, she snatched it from the floor, its edges still sharp, and shoved it deep into a leather pouch at her belt. The official city archives were a place of profound silence, a stark and sterile contrast to the riot of life that had just flooded her mind. Here, history was not lived but stored, codified on endless spools of brass wire that fed into intricate clockwork terminals. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and oiled machinery. There was no hum here, only the soft, rhythmic click and whir of the archive engines processing the city's flawless, authorized past. Ilara's hands were unsteady as she keyed her query into a public terminal, the polished brass keys cool beneath her fingertips. She began with the name that had been imprinted on her soul. Lorik, the machine whirred, spools turning in a blur of metallic grace. The result was delivered on a small, ticking panel. No record found. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Impossible. He was more real to her than the terminal she was touching. She tried again, broadening her search. She keyed in the date from the memory, a specific day of the sun's zenith festival she now remembered with impossible clarity. The archive terminal clicked and whirred once more, its internal mechanisms aligning the city's collective memory. The result that appeared made her blood run cold. The day had not been a festival. The record described it as a day of solemn civic duty, marked by quiet reflection and a city-wide mandate for productive labor in the name of progress. There was no mention of banners, music, or a laughing man with a child on his shoulders. The official history was not just different, it was a perfect diametric opposite. A lie. Leaning against the cold brass of the terminal, the truth crashed down upon her. The hum, the grating dissonance she had felt her entire life, was not a flaw in her own senses. It was the sound of reality tearing at its seams. It was the screaming ghost of a memory that refused to be forgotten, the echo of a man named Lorik who laughed in a festival that never was. Master Theron's words about smoothing the rough edges of history, about creating a more perfect timeline, took on a horrific new meaning. They were not smoothing. They were erasing. They were cutting out the pieces of life that did not fit their sterile design and casting them into oblivion. The memory of the man's face, the phantom feeling of his daughter's small hand in hers, haunted her. It was a ghost, but it was a warm and vital one, a stark contrast to the cold, dead perfection of the guild's manufactured peace. As she pushed herself away from the terminal and walked out of the silent archives into the gaslit twilight of Aethelberg, the cracked ingot at her side felt like a terrible, precious secret. The hum was still there, a constant companion, but its nature had changed. It was no longer a source of pain or confusion. It was a map. It was a signpost pointing to the cracks in the world, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled and electrified her, that she had to find more. The great temporal forge was never truly silent. Even in the gray hours between shifts, when the main furnaces lay dormant and the roar of 1,000 hammers was but a memory, a low thrumming pervaded the cavernous space. It was the sound of cooling metal, of pressure being maintained, of the city's stolen past being held in a state of suspended animation. For Alara, this was merely the baseline, the canvas upon which a far more discordant sound was painted. The hum she alone could hear was now a known quantity, a screaming wound in reality she was determined to explore. She moved through the shadows of the forge floor, a ghost in her own workplace. Her official reason for being there, a falsified work order to recalibrate the pressure gauges on the reclamation feeders, was flimsy but would hold for a time. It gave her access to the forgotten corners of the process, the places where mistakes were sent to be unmade. Heaps of slag and discarded metal rose like miniature mountain ranges, but her target was the bins of flawed ingots. Ingots that had cracked during forging, their temporal charges unstable, their encapsulated moments leaking at the seams. They were considered industrial waste, failures to be melted down and repurposed. To Ilara, they were artifacts of a murdered history. Her fingers, still covered in fine forging dust, trembled as she reached into the first cast iron bin. The general hum sharpened the moment her hand passed the rim. It was like tuning a vast, invisible instrument. She sifted through the cool, smooth rectangles of metal, each one inert, dead. Then her knuckles brushed against one with a hairline fracture running across its face. A jolt, cold and sharp, shot up her arm. The dissonant hum in her skull crescendoed into a sickening whine, a dentist's drill against a raw nerve. She flinched, pulling her hand back. The cracked ingot from the archives, tucked securely in her belt pouch, seemed to vibrate in sympathy. Taking a shallow breath, she forced herself to pick up the flawed ingot. The moment her skin made contact, a flash of an image, gray and washed out, seared itself behind her eyes. Not a full, immersive vision like Lorik's festival, but a shard of experience. The smell of medicinal herbs and cloying decay, the sight of a cobblestone street, empty save for shuttered windows marked with a stark black cross. A feeling of profound communal dread, a city holding its breath in fear of a sickness that crept through the walls. The red cough, a plague she'd never read about, a terror that had been deemed too unpleasant for the city's collective memory. It had been forged out of existence, its victims and heroes erased, the trauma neatly excised. The hum screamed with the voices of the forgotten sick, a chorus of ghosts denied their own suffering. She dropped the ingot as if it were burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. The guild wasn't just removing inconvenient festivals. They were cutting out the city's scars, leaving behind a history of pristine, unblemished skin that had never known a wound. But a scar is proof of healing, proof of survival. What was a city that had never survived anything? She felt a wave of nausea, but pushed it down. She had to know how deep the rot went. She moved to the next bin, this one filled with larger ingots from the civic history section. Her search was more frantic now, the need to know overriding the instinct to flee. Her fingers found another imperfection, a deep chip on the corner of a heavy ingot. She hesitated for only a second before grabbing it. The resulting psychic impact was a physical blow. The hum became a roar of outrage, of angry shouts and the splintering of wood. She saw a public square, not the pristine plaza she knew, but a roiling mass of people. Banners bearing unfamiliar symbols were held high. A man on a makeshift platform was shouting, his face contorted with passion, his words about justice and representation lost to the cacophony. Then, from the periphery of the vision, came the chronosmith's enforcers, their brass and steel uniforms immaculate against the chaos. They didn't raise weapons. They raised polished temporal resonators, and as the devices activated, the scene did not dissolve into violence, but into nothing. The people, the banners, the shouting man, they flickered, thinned, and vanished, their moment of defiance unwoven from the tapestry of time. Ilara stumbled back, leaning against a cold steel pillar for support. The pain in her head was immense, a migraine laced with the phantom echoes of 1,000 stolen voices. An uprising, a plea for a different future, erased. They hadn't just silenced dissent. They had made it so it had never existed at all. She felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. How many of the placid, content citizens she passed every day were descendants of revolutionaries who no longer had a cause to fight for? A dreadful pattern began to crystallize in her mind. It was a systematic culling of anything that did not fit the guild's narrative of placid productivity. Chaos, disease, dissent. She found smaller chips of ingots, each a tiny scream of a lost idea. A painter whose work was too visceral, their colors too raw, their memory a splash of vibrant, unwanted emotion. A philosopher whose writings on the nature of free will were now blank pages in a forgotten book. an inventor whose temporal device might have challenged the guild's monopoly. Each flawed ingot she touched added another voice to the choir of the damned singing in her skull. They were the artists, the thinkers, the rebels, the inconvenient. They were the grit and soul of a city, and they had been rendered down into a uniform sterile slurry. The psychic pressure was becoming unbearable. The forge, once a place of purpose, now felt like a mausoleum. Every surface seemed to vibrate with the agony of what it had helped to unmake. She felt a desperate urge to run, to hide in the silence of her small apartment, and pretend none of this was real. But she knew she couldn't. The hum was a part of her now, a compass needle pointing to the heart of the wound. As she made a final, sweeping pass through a pile of rejects, destined for the morning's melt, her hand brushed against it. It was different from the others. The ingot was cool to the touch, yet a tremor of impossible, terrifying warmth shot up her arm. The chaotic chorus of screams in her mind did not just get louder, it focused, sharpened into a single piercing note of such clarity and resonance that it silenced everything else. This sound was not the agony of a stranger. It was a note she had known her entire life, the foundational tone of her own personal dissonance, the hum that had always set her apart. It was a phantom limb, a missing piece of her own soul screaming for reunion. She snatched her hand away, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, as if approaching a venomous snake, she reached back and wrapped her fingers around the ingot. It fit in her palm perfectly. The metal was smooth, save for a single deep crack that ran through its core like a frozen bolt of lightning. She held it, her knuckles white. There was no fleeting vision, no shard of a stranger's past. There was only that horribly familiar, intimate resonance, a vibration that seemed to originate from her own bones. A certainty settled over her, cold and absolute. This memory was not about a plague or a riot or a forgotten artist. It was about her. To access it would not be to witness history. It would be to confront the reason for the emptiness she had always carried. The truth was in her hand, and it felt like it had the weight of a collapsing world. The ingot was cold in her hand, a dead weight of brass and crystal that pulsed with a secret, silent rhythm against her palm. Back in the sterile quiet of her small apartment, the oppressive heat and clanging industry of the great forge felt a world away. Here there were only the regulated, muted sounds of the city at rest, the gentle whir of the public chronometers marking the passage of state-sanctioned time. But the ingot in her hand, the one that resonated not with the screams of a forgotten plague or the fury of a phantom uprising, but with the intimate, familiar hum of her own soul, was louder than all of it. It thrummed with a private frequency, a dissonant chord that had played in the background of her entire life. It was a sound she had always tried to ignore, a flaw in her own perception. Now, she understood it was a signal. Her official records, the ones she had so meticulously maintained in the archive, stated her parents were respected artisans, lost in a tragic forge accident. They were a neat, tidy story with a clean, sad ending, a closed loop. But this ingot felt like a loose thread, a snag in the smooth fabric of that accepted reality. Holding it? The constant, low-grade ache of emptiness that had defined her existence, sharpened into a focused, piercing point of pain. It was the agony of a phantom limb, a part of herself she never knew was missing. The hum was not a flaw in her. It was a question demanding an answer. With trembling fingers, Ilara clutched the ingot, its cracked surface digging into her skin. She closed her eyes, shutting out the muted gray of her room, and focused on the sound. For the first time, she did not pull away from the grating dissonance. She leaned into it, let it fill her senses, followed its jagged, discordant melody back to its source. The air grew thick and heavy, the scent of ozone and superheated metal flooding her apartment. The gentle whirring of the city faded, replaced by a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated not in her ears, but in her very bones. The ingot grew warm, then hot, a burning point of contact with a world unseen. The vision did not burst upon her, it bled into her. It was a memory of warmth, of laughter, that felt more real than any she had ever heard. A woman with kind eyes and hair the color of spun copper, a man with a steady hand and a voice like deep, rumbling earth. They were hers. The knowledge was immediate, absolute, a truth that settled into the hollow spaces within her. They moved through a workshop filled not with clockwork and gears, but with strange swirling glass and glowing filaments of raw, untamed time. They were not artisans. They were scientists, theorists, heretics. The scene shifted. The warmth was gone, replaced by the cold tension of a hidden argument. The man, her father, stood before a younger, leaner Master Theron. His face was not yet etched with paternal pity, but was sharp with unwavering conviction. You cannot simply erase what you fear, Theron. Her father's voice pleaded, laced with frustration. History is not a ledger to be balanced. Every event, good or bad, is a load-bearing pillar. You start removing them, and the whole structure will collapse. We are creating peace, Theron countered, his voice smooth, reasonable. We are sparing future generations the burden of our mistakes. The red cough, the uprising of the cogsmiths, these are traumas that serve no purpose but to breed more fear and division. By removing them, we create a stable, productive society, a better world. Her mother stepped forward, placing a hand on her father's arm. Her gaze was fiery. A better world built on a lie? The pain is part of the lesson. The struggle is what gives our peace meaning. What you are doing is not healing, Theron. It is mutilation. The final memory was a torrent of sensory chaos. It was not a scene, but a feeling. The feeling of being unwritten. There was no violence, no flash of light, only a sickening unraveling. The faces of her parents flickered, their features blurring like watercolor in the rain. Their voices echoed and stretched, thinning into whispers, then into silence. The workshop dissolved around them, its unique tools and glowing filaments fading back into the gray, regulated architecture of the guild. The hum in her mind crescendoed into a deafening roar of static, the sound of a paradox tearing itself apart. It was the sound of their existence being forcibly, meticulously, and utterly erased. Ilara gasped, her eyes flying open. She was on the floor of her apartment, the ingot lying beside her, now inert and cold. The hum was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer a vague, external annoyance. It was the echo of her parents' voices. It was the ghost of their workshop. It was the sound of her own past, a past that was not supposed to exist, fighting to be remembered. She was not the daughter of respected artisans. She was the child of dissidents, of ghosts. A living, breathing paradox anchored to the present only by the strange sensitivity that tied her to the great temporal forge, the very machine that had devoured her family. A cold dread washed over her, more terrifying than any phantom memory. The guild had not just sanitized history. They had hunted and eliminated those who tried to stop them. Her parents. And now she knew. She held the proof in her hands and in her head. This knowledge made her a threat, a loose end in their perfectly woven timeline. They would not hesitate to erase her, to snuff out the dissonant hum of her life as if she had never been. The weight of the secret was crushing, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. She was utterly alone, a ghost haunting a city of amnesiacs. But the thought was followed by another, a name, a face. Cale, gruff, pragmatic, but a friend. The only one she had. She could not do this alone. She had to tell him. She had to make him understand. The gear-grinding clamor of the lower city was a familiar song, a rhythm Cale had built his life around. He didn't look up from the delicate timepiece on his workbench when the workshop door slid open, the chiming of its counterweight bell lost in the din. He was meticulously seating a ruby bearing, a task that demanded absolute focus. Only when a shadow fell over his hands did he grunt in annoyance, lifting his gaze to see Alara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a frantic energy that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. She was vibrating with a tension that felt more than just emotional. She didn't speak, only held out the flawed time ingot. It looked like a shard of smoked glass, impurities swirling in its depths like a captured storm. Cale recoiled instinctively. He had seen what cracked ingots could do, the psychic wreckage they left behind. He started to wave it away, to tell her to get that cursed thing to the nearest guild reclamation furnace before it shattered her mind. But she pushed it closer. The air in the small workshop grew thick, heavy. A low, grating hum began to fill the space, a sound that seemed to come from inside his own skull. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny gears all turning against each other, grinding themselves to dust. "They're lying to us, Cale," she whispered, her voice tight and raw. "All of it." "A lie." He shook his head, a gesture of both denial and concern. She looked unwell, haunted. This was the damage he had feared. But then he noticed the chronometers. On the wall behind her, a row of his most precisely calibrated clocks began to twitch. The second hand on a grand regulator shuddered, jumping forward 3 ticks, then stalling. A delicate pocket watch on his bench, its case open, began to spin its hands in a frantic, silent blur. He stared, his machinist's mind rebelling against the impossibility. There was no mechanical fault that could cause this. It was wrong. Ilara followed his gaze, her expression a mixture of terror and vindication. "It's not just a sound," she said. The hum growing more insistent, a physical pressure in the room. "It's the timeline. Straining. They've cut things out, Cale. People. Events. They erased my parents." She finally let her story spill out, a torrent of impossible truths about dissident scientists, a younger, colder Master Theron, and the horrifying, silent unraveling of her family from the fabric of reality. She spoke of the hum she had felt her entire life, not as a defect in her own mind, but as the ghost of her own past fighting to exist. Cale's skepticism warred with the evidence of his own eyes. The gears on a half-assembled automaton on a nearby table began to chatter, its brass fingers clenching and unclenching spasmodically. He felt a wave of vertigo, the solid floor seeming to shift beneath his feet. He looked from his misbehaving clocks to Alara's terrified, pleading face, and then to the dark ingot in her hand. It was the epicenter of this wrongness, a splinter of truth in a world of polished falsehood. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was telling the truth. The Chronosmiths' Guild, the benevolent shepherd of their history and guarantor of their peace, was a monstrous fabrication. He reached out and gently closed her hand around the ingot, his calloused fingers covering hers. The hum in the room subsided, and his clocks returned to their steady, familiar ticking. The silence they left behind was more terrifying than the noise. He had built his life on the principles of order, precision, and the predictable march of time. Ilara had just shown him that all of it was a fragile illusion. "What they did to your parents," he said, his voice low and steady despite the tremor in his hands, "they will do to you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She nodded, a single sharp movement. For the first time since entering, a flicker of something other than fear crossed her face. Resolve. They spent the next hour in hushed, urgent whispers, the vast humming machinery of the city outside their small fortress of shared conspiracy. Cale, ever the pragmatist, began to outline the monumental scale of their problem. The guild was everything. It was the government, the bank, the church. To challenge it was to challenge reality itself. They needed proof, something more than a single flawed ingot and a story that sounded like madness. They needed a plan. As Cale was sketching a crude schematic of the guild's archives on a slate, the bell on the workshop door chimed again. It was not a customer. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, clad in the severe, unadorned robes of a guild acolyte. His face was a mask of serene neutrality, but his eyes were cold and sharp. He did not look at Cale, did not acknowledge the workshop or its intricate contents.